This is Gloria with Farmstead Talk, and I am here today with Jenn Becker. And Jenn is a member of Growing Colorado, a Homesteaders Community. And so with that, Jenn, are you ready to get started with the interview today?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, great. So we know your name, Jenn. So can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and a little bit about you?
Of course. So I'm actually a native to Colorado. I'm from Denver. I grew up in North Denver, and I was raised by my dad's parents, so my grandparents.
Now,
And then I am currently married. I just got married almost 2 months ago, and I've got two boys, Justin and Jack. Justin is 13 and Jack is 10, and they both have muscular dystrophy, so they keep me pretty busy.
oh boy, okay. So congratulations on your wedding.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have a pretty busy life.
A little bit, yeah.
So what was your first experience with gardening?
My first experience, I have been gardening my whole entire life. So my grandpa that raised me was actually raised on a farm in Craig, Colorado. So ever since I could remember, we've always had a big garden in the backyard.
Nice. I've never been to Craig. Is it a pretty rural area? It's
I
mountainous, isn't it?
Yeah, so it is actually very northern Colorado. I've only driven through it one time. It's really pretty though, but there's not a whole lot up there.
What did your grandfather grow? Did he have
Um,
orchards or?
it sounds like they grew a little bit of everything. And I know that they didn't grow watermelons, although his neighbors did. But he decided that he didn't want to farm his whole life, so he ended up leaving Craig to go to the Army, but he's always had gardening with him.
Okay. So my next question to you is going to be, what was your greatest inspiration? It sounds like Grandpa was your greatest inspiration.
It would definitely be my grandpa. So I just remember always having a garden and having fresh vegetables during the summer.
Yeah, that's a great memory, isn't it?
It really is.
So with that, what kind of gardening do you do? And like what type of gardening do you do? Like what method do you use?
So I actually use a couple. This year I built a hugelkultur in my backyard, which has been crazy, but kind of just grown over by bindweed this year. I can't really say if it's been good or bad yet. Maybe I'll have an answer for that next year after it's a little more tried. But then this year, over the summer, we decided to completely redo our entire front yard, and we now have raised beds in the front yard.
Cool. You had mentioned to me sometime before that you have a community garden with your church. And could you tell us a little bit about that? I'm interested in hearing about that.
Of course. So let's see, I want to say 2014 we started the garden. There was, it's about on an acre of land, and there was an empty plot. So I said, hey, why don't we put this to use and bring people in from the community and start a garden? So from there, the first year it was kind of just whatever size area you wanted, just rototill that and then do what you could with that. And then the next year we actually got a grant, and were able to, we took a tractor and tilled the whole entire area and had 180 cubic yards of the best compost I've ever seen donated to us. So we tilled all of that in, and then we ended up going with cinder blocks to line all of the garden plots, and they are each 10 feet by 20 feet, so they're good sized gardens. And we have 35 garden plots, and then there's also a community area where we've got like berries, and then if people want to come in from the community that don't have a garden plot, they're able to go ahead and take fresh vegetables.
Oh man, sounds so wonderful. And I love to hear about the compost. Composting is such a great thing for Colorado because we have such horrible soils.
We really
So
do. It was terrible. I mean, the first year when we rototilled, there were so many rocks.
yeah.
Of course, and lots of clay. So anyone that had a garden plot, there was only 5 of us that year. They were told to bring their own amendments if they wanted to. So in mine, I threw a bunch of compost. But the land that it was on used to be a house that had been torn down. So where I had my garden actually was where they had their garden. So I got pretty lucky with my
Oh yeah,
soil.
that's good. That's good. Yeah. So with that, with the church group, now, is this something that the church volunteers, or are those paid spots for their bed?
So for all of the plots, everybody essentially rents their plot for the year. So they are each individually maintained. So people can bring in whatever amendments they want to. We usually have a day in the spring where we rototill garden plots if they want to. And then, so basically what they're paying for is just water, and then whatever else goes back into the garden. So there are community tools, and there's community work days, and we do barbecues. So it all goes straight back into the garden.
I would love to visit that. Can I come out and visit that
Of
sometime?
course, it's over in Lakewood. That would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. The next question I want to talk to is about water. You were just talking about water, but before I do that, I want to go back and jump back real quick. You had mentioned about you started a hugelkultur. Can you
Yes,
can you tell our audience a little bit about what that is and what that is made up of? A little
of
bit about
course.
that.
So it's essentially trying to mimic what is already in nature. So the way that I started mine was I had just a flat garden area. It's not very big. I want to say it's maybe 10 feet by 10 feet big, in a back corner at my house. And then I put down a layer of logs, and then a layer of smaller branches. And then we were actually given some composted horse manure that had been composted for over a year, so it wasn't hot anymore. And then I put half of my personal compost pile onto it. And then the dirt that I had before, I had already had a garden plot there, so it was like topsoil mixed in with more compost. And I just put that on top of it, and it's in a mound. And the whole theory behind it is that as everything composts down, the logs in the bottom hold on to all of the moisture like a sponge. So I honestly haven't really watered it much at all. Um, like I said, there's been a lot of bindweed, so that would be my only issue with it, but it's been doing really well outside of that.
So do you think the bindweed came from like compost seed, or do you think it's just,
We just have a lot of bindweed anyways, so it was already there. The house that we've been in for the past year and a half, before we were here, the whole entire backyard was basically bindweed. So it's a never-ending battle, and
it
I
is?
just pull it because really, I mean, if you're gonna find something that's gonna kill the bindweed, it's probably gonna kill you too. So I just try and stay on top of pulling it. And we do have some lawn because, like I said, I've got my boys, and then we also have a dog. So, you know, I still want room for them to run around and play on, and we don't use anything on it that would hurt either my children or the dog. So it's nice to still have that. But basically, at this point, our lawn has beat the bindweed for the most part. There's a couple spots, but healthy lawn will basically just get rid of it.
Yeah. So did you, when you started that, did you have to dig out a trench and then start it from like a lower level underground, or did you start it above ground?
Um, so you can do either way, but for me, I think we started maybe about a foot underground just because I dug out the garden soil we already had, which is probably where part of the bindweed came from. Um, so, and it is probably, I want to say about 4 feet tall.
Okay. Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because I think that I have created a Hugel culture system, but not on purpose. So what I did, so what I did is I had an area that I was just starting to just throw like all my food scraps and everything, and it got bigger and bigger. And so I had a compost pile. Then I started
Right.
throwing just like smaller logs on top. And eventually it got to be about 3 or 4 feet. And so I think that's what I had. And then I started to grow on top of that.
Oh, that sounds
So
awesome.
I didn't do it on purpose, but it's nature, and that's how things work. And, you know, it was in my old garden, my old home, but it was
Oh,
an
nice.
area, it was in an area that it was fabulous. So it was a great growing um, environment, great microsystem. So, okay, back to watering now, and back to your community garden. So you started telling me that the participants would have to pay for their water. Water is a huge issue in Colorado. it seems like we're always going through some kind of drought, and we're in a semi-arid climate. So what do you use at home? I know that the community garden, they kind of maintain, each owner maintains their own garden, but what do you do at home for your watering situation?
So at home right now, it's just hand watering. But I actually watched a video on Back to Eden gardening, which I took inspiration from it, as in the day I watched it, we just happened to have a bunch of wood chips at our house that had already sat around for a year. Because the downside to the wood chips is they will basically suck all the nitrogen out of your soil.
Absolutely.
So these had already sat for a year, so that wasn't really a concern for me. So I actually went out and put those down as well. So they help to hold in the moisture. And literally, like within 2 days of putting those out, I could already tell it had made a huge difference. So at home, that's what I do. And then I just hand water, because we were a little crazy this summer and decided to have a wedding and tear out our front yard and do a million other things.
Yeah.
So we didn't get irrigation in, but I would like to do drip hoses or some sort of irrigation within each garden bed. And then at the garden, everyone is, like I said, they're responsible for their own, but it is all just hand watering at this point. Although we did have one person who made a whole entire system in their plot made out of PVC pipes, and they put holes in it. And it was buried just, I want to say maybe an inch or two underneath the soil. So it just watered the roots, and they swore by it, and their garden was great. So
Oh yeah, that's a great method as well. So I myself, I hand water, and I gotta tell you, it is so time consuming because I have
it
such a very
is.
large property and it's so spread out in different areas. So it's almost like a good 4 hours for me to have to water. And next year, well, we're gonna be putting in some irrigation, but
Nice.
it's definitely important in Colorado. Um, so what is your biggest challenge with gardening, would you say?
I would have to say it's gardening in Colorado. The weather is crazy,
Yeah.
as we all know. Um, and then this year, I actually was dealing with stink bugs, which is crazy because I've never had to deal with them before. And I would say it's a little different where I live because I live in Keensburg out past Brighton. So out here, knock on wood, we don't have Japanese beetles. So I'm very grateful for that.
I
But
have
then
David.
at the garden, we do have them, and they're everywhere. And so that's definitely a battle at the garden. But you know, at my house, it's just the weather. I mean, this year was crazy, and I didn't plant my tomatoes till towards the end of June, I think.
And that's good for
So
you because
yeah.
and I'm down in southern Colorado. So I put mine in, around Mother's Day, and I knew better, and I got hit like 3 times with hail and a late frost, and
Yeah.
that wiped out my chances of fruit on my orchard. So messed me up, but
Well,
still a learning experience down here.
last year at the garden, there's one girl at the garden who she basically helps me run the garden, and she's amazing. Her name is Cora. Her and I last year had one whole entire plot of tomatoes, and we would donate some, we would use some for ourselves, but it was literally probably, I don't even know how many tomato plants. It was crazy. And we had literally just gotten done planting them last year, and then we got 4 inches of hail. So I think just because of that and the years past,
You
I
learned your
have
lesson.
I have no problem waiting.
Yeah.
So
And I feel like even though we do have a short growing season, I think it kind of starts late sometimes, and then it just runs a little late too.
yeah,
So
that's kind of how
usually
it seems.
down, until the end of September, we're still harvesting. So
Last year I was harvesting all the way into October.
yeah,
So I don't really mind it being a little bit
I
later.
think your first frost date is October 1st this year, and I
I
think
think
mine's
so.
October 6th.
Yeah.
So, so with that, what's your favorite thing to grow in the garden?
I would have to say tomatoes.
Too.
This year, so when I got engaged a week before Thanksgiving last year, I swore to my fiance that I was not going to grow any tomatoes from seed. And then somehow I ended up with, I think, 25 different varieties of tomatoes. And it was starting to take over the house. So it was a little
Oh,
crazy.
I hear you with that. I actually started way early. I started in January, starting all my tomatoes and my plants under lights in a grow room downstairs in the basement. And I just babied them and really took very good care of them. Put them out in May, and like I said, I got hit by
Yeah.
hail and I lost so much. So I'm dealing with a very small amount of gardening beds, raised beds, as well as I have what's called a corral garden, which is another garden that used to be an old corral down in the back of my property. And so I got a couple things, and I'm getting a good harvest out of them, but I bet you I lost 3/4 of all my plants this year. So next year I'm going to be putting up shade cloth as well as some row covers for hail and frost prevention.
Right. Last year, I actually ended up buying 1/4-inch hardware cloth because so we moved in this house April of last year, so it was a little late for me to start anything, and there was no available like in-ground room for gardening or anything, so I just started them in containers last year. So I made a whole entire like the top of it was all the 1/4-inch hardware cloth, and then on the sides I used just regular window screen, and it completely like saved my tomatoes.
Oh, that's a fabulous idea, using the hardware cloth.
Yeah, it's a little expensive, but it saves your tomatoes. I mean,
It's
you know,
good
that,
for if you're going to use good like pot for pots.
yeah, it was great because then the structure I made, I could also move wherever I needed to. So it wasn't a big deal. But
Oh,
it saved all of my tomatoes, which was great because we had hail 3 times last year and it was all like golf ball sized or bigger and it was just destroying everything. So I was really glad that I had bought that because then it saved my tomato plants.
yeah, that's a great idea, actually. So what does gardening do for you besides bringing food and beauty to the garden to you? What does it
Um,
mean
for,
to you?
for me, I mean, obviously it reminds me of gardening with my grandpa, but also I've taught my kids how to garden. At the community garden, they have their own garden plots and they're like so excited. My younger son was super excited because he grew blueberry tomatoes this year and he absolutely loves them. So before this year, they absolutely refused to eat tomatoes. And I was joking because Jess from Roots and Refuge Farm had said store-bought tomatoes taste like disappointment. So I kept telling
Well,
my kids
we all
that.
know that. We
Of
love
course.
yes.
So this year, though, the boys decided that they actually wanted to try tomatoes, and they were like, "Wait a minute, this actually tastes good. These aren't like the ones that I've had before." And I was like,
No
"That's because they were from the
disappointment.
store." So they actually like tomatoes this year, and we plant peas just so that we can have something to snack on in the garden. But for me, it's kind of just freedom because moving out of the city, now we can do what we want, but I like growing my own food and knowing where it comes from. Plus it tastes better.
And what a great learning experience for your boys.
Yeah, they love it.
Yeah.
So,
So next question is, do you consider yourself a homesteader? And if so, what does that mean to you to be a homesteader?
so I think until probably about a month ago, I didn't. But then it changed because I watched, a lot of vlogs on YouTube and the people that I consider homesteaders, that have more land, that have animals, um, I always thought that like that was what homesteading was, but they keep saying they're like, well, just use what you have now. And they've
Absolutely.
said, I really wish that before we would have had land, we would have done more with what we had. So
Absolutely.
at this point, I want to say, yeah, we are because we're trying to grow our own food. We're trying to be, more self-reliant. And I think next spring we're actually going to get chickens. And I was just we found them on Facebook Marketplace and it was like about a half an hour away, but we were given a bunch of windows. So now we get to make our own window greenhouse, which is really going to help.
That's awesome. Yeah, I always say, and as like our YouTube hero says, she's my YouTube hero. Use the space you got and
Yeah,
let it be a learning environment for you. And yeah, I think that anybody can be a homesteader. Even if you just have the desire in your heart, so you're a homesteader at heart, and you have to
right.
start somewhere. And like I said in the newsletter, you know, there's so many different types of homesteaders, mobile homesteaders who live in RVs that, you know, maybe they stay in a campground for the summer. They can grow in pots like you did. And,
Right.
you know, there's just so many different types. City dwellers can be homesteaders, and, you know, people on large ranchers can be homesteaders. It's a personal, you know, perspective as of what it is actually. So,
I agree with that. Actually, for a while, I was a single mom, and just I was trying to do the best I could with my boys, and they were still little. And we lived in a one-bedroom apartment in the city, and it was tiny. But I had pots everywhere on our balcony, and we still were able to have so many fresh herbs and tomatoes and peppers.
and it's not
So,
just about gardening either. I mean, it's about growing anything that's going to make your life easier and simple and
yeah.
whole, natural. You know, some people just love to bake and they love to make, you know, organic bread and or sew their kids' clothes or teach them at home. And yeah, there's a whole realm of different topics for gardening and for homesteading, and I don't know. Yeah, so do you think that you would say that homesteading is something to be proud of, or is it something that you feel like it is minimized? And the reason I ask that is most people would say, yeah, I'm proud to do this. But there was a time that homesteading was like really a couple of years ago, you know, maybe back in 2010 to 14, it was a really huge thing. Everybody wanted to be a homesteader, and it was like more power to them. And I felt like it was almost like a trend or a movement. And I feel like a little bit it's been going off the wayside, but there's still a bunch of diehard people that are on YouTube and throughout the community that really believe in homesteading. Um, do you think that it's something that you're proud of and that you want to share and discuss, or do you feel like it's something that you want to minimize it, almost like you'd be like, oh, well, you know, this is homemade and maybe it's not as good as what somebody else has?
I'm really proud of it. And I mean, I think anything homemade is always going to be better than something you're going to buy. And I kind of feel as though it's still, I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily just homesteading, but I think gardening in general lately has kind of been like a really cool thing to do. And like people have more houseplants and it is becoming more trendy, but I think it's good because, you know, then people are growing more of their own food and, just becoming, you know, slightly more self-sustainable, even if it's just because they're like, oh, this tomato sounds really cool, or, you know, something like that. But I definitely share it with everybody. And I've never exactly been one to follow the trends. I've always kind of started my own. So,
Same here. Like I did this when it wasn't cool, you know,
yeah.
just it just wasn't cool. I mean, when I was 18 years old, I lived in a condominium in Niwot, Colorado. And I had rabbits and I had a chicken, and I almost got evicted from my apartment because I wanted to be a farmer. I wanted to be a farmer and have my own stuff and grow my own things since I was way young.
Yeah.
And it stayed with me. And I don't know where that seed came from, but it was planted some time ago when I was a child. And because I wasn't by any means brought up on a farm or anything like that, but I just always had the love for it. So we're about ready to finish up here, and I just have one more thing to ask you. So if you could sum up your experience or your feelings about gardening or homesteading, what would that word be?
I think it would be happiness, just about the simplicity of it all, because I think a lot of people just get caught up in, you know, being busy and being on technology and all of the crazy things like that. But I just like the simplicity of it all.
Yeah. Well, Jen, thank you so much, and I appreciate you partaking in this interview today. You have a great day.
You too. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks, Jen. Bye-bye.